I just wanted to kick off, as we are welcoming people in, I wanted to kick off by also to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet today. Of course, we're meeting on a range of lands, but I am on the country of the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respect to them, their culture, and elders past, present and emerging, and I'll extend that respect to the traditional owners of the land on which you all sit or stand today. We have people from all across Australia and even over the oceans, New Zealand and elsewhere. So we're very happy to be able to host Helen today, which I think might be a premiere, especially in this kind of format, of this research. And it's especially exciting for me because we've had some really early conversations about this stuff, Helen. I think, you know, I might have been one of your subjects at one point.
I think a lot of people here were actually, which is great.
A lot of people, yeah. No, so it's fantastic. Just a couple of Zoom protocols. Please keep yourselves on mute. We are in a meeting setting, but please stay on mute and use the chat if you do have questions or points of clarification that you're seeking. I'll keep an eye on that. Matt Gordon's also here to keep an eye on that for us. So we will have opportunities to ask questions of Helen as we go. But yeah, it's over to you, Helen, in a moment. I just wanted to let participants know, if they haven't been in a conference session yet, we are going to be recording. We are currently recording right now, and those recordings will be available to people at the end, but only via the Kapia newsletter. So you need to be signed up to the Kapia newsletter in order to get any of the things that come out of the sessions today. I'm sure most of you probably already are, but just in case, the link is up on the website now. We'll drop it into the chat as well. The other thing that's good for you to know is we've set up a Facebook group for the conference, or a Facebook page for the conference, so we can virtually network with each other after and between sessions. So again, you know, let's keep the conversation going outside of these formats as well. So I think that's kind of the formal stuff, Helen. I also just want to introduce you formally as not just my friend and colleague in the community engagement sector, but Helen, you are an engagement specialist and researcher, and as principal for the public engagement practice, you work with organisations to design and deliver participatory processes and build people's capability to design and deliver engagement for themselves. You're also an industry fellow at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology in Sydney, where you recently completed a PhD exploring the practice and professionalisation of community engagement in Australia, in Australian local government in particular, where you also regularly lecture at UTS. You're also an IAP2 Australasian trainer, which I have experienced. It's fantastic. And in your spare time, you love to travel, see live music. Oh, at the moment, well, you probably can where you are. But now you also do puzzles and dance to 80s tunes in your living room. You are a lady of my own heart. Congratulations on this important piece of work. Congratulations, Dr. Helen Christensen. It's an absolute privilege to have you here today, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. The privilege is certainly all mine. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where I am located, which is the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Meanjin, or Brisbane, which is currently filled with jacarandas and extremely dry. My money is on a flood for the end of the year. So welcome to the session. We've only got kind of the best part of about 50 minutes, and I've probably got about 5 hours of stuff that I want to show you and talk to you about. So what you're getting is essentially a kind of quick and dirty version of about 20% of my PhD focus section that's focused on practitioners. So it is going to be pretty brisk, so I'll jump into it. So today's session, this was the questions that we kind of posed in an attempt to lure people in. Who are they? Where have they come from? What do they do? What do they struggle with? And that number one question of, are they really that good looking? Which I noticed Claire changed on her promotional materials to say, why are they that good looking? So she's already made up her mind, which is fabulous. I do want to say that I am really excited to be here. So some of this research I have presented in academic circles, and it's still as meaningful. The discussion is often a little bit different, but for me to present to actual practitioners who I have researched and who this is about is super exciting. I'm just conscious of the fact that I want to have kind of hour-long conversations, but I think I've got a bit of a workaround for that. So before we start, this is very much a presentation, even though this is an engagement conference and there'll be lots of workshops and breakout groups and all the rest of it. This is not one of those sessions. There will be lots of slides. There will be graphs. It's going to move pretty quick. If at any point you sort of go, she's talking too fast, there's that little thing that says slow down. I'm going to ignore that, right? Just watch the video again on slower pace. I got way too much to show you and it's all way too exciting. I'm going to leave questions and comments to the end if we actually have time for them, because I'm conscious with 50 minutes, if we sort of stop, we might lose 20 minutes and it might be only in an area a few people are interested in. So we'll kind of leave that to the end. However, this is my kind of workaround that I came up with while I was having a shower this morning. If you're super interested in this stuff and you want to talk about it, because I'm just going to throw lots of stuff at you, maybe jot down some notes on things that you think are interesting or things that you want to talk about with fellow practitioners, and we'll kind of gauge interest at the end as to whether you want to kind of workshop some of this and have a bit of a chat about it, because I'm super interested in all of this stuff. I'll also send out I'll put a page together of cool links, particularly stuff that's not hidden behind paywalls, and I'll kind of, if you want to email me at the end, I can send that through, but I'll put that up again at the end. So the plan for the session. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about why this area of research, so a bit of kind of orientating stuff. I'm going to talk about what we already know, so I'm going to show you some of the research. I'm going to talk about how I went about my research. That's only a slide. And then I'm going to talk about my findings, which are kind of centered around who the practitioner cohort are and how they kind of operate, as well as what they struggle with and what their kind of tensions are, because it's a very interesting kind of practice, which you already know. I'm also going to talk about what's coming up as a little bit of coming soon in the research space. And then, of course, that questions and answers at the end. Now, the question that I think has brought a lot of people here is, are practitioners that good looking? So I'm going to ask you just for a moment to turn on your cameras. You only need them on for a couple of seconds. Turn on your cameras if you're a practitioner, please. Cameras on if you're a practitioner. Let's see your beautiful faces. There's no judgment if you haven't washed your hair or you're not. Oh, actually, maybe you should wear clothes. Turn on your cameras, flick through the screens, give each other a wave. You are now currently doing your own empirical research to determine if this is a good looking bunch of people or not. I'm not going to make the judgment. I'm going to leave that one to you. Oh, look at them. I think they're pretty good looking. Aren't they gorgeous? Oh, beautiful mix. Oh, the diversity, spectacular. What do you reckon, Claire? Gorgeous?
Yep.
Gorgeous.
I see my favourite Emily Physic there. Hello.
Awesome. So, yeah, I see people I've worked with, people I've interviewed. It's awesome. I wish I had time to have a chat with all of you. All right. So you're beautiful. We've ticked that box. Let's move on. In terms of this area of research, I am and some of you know this, I am a bit of a researcher. I'm a bit of a practitioner and I'm a little bit confused. So I'm coming at this today with my researcher hat on, but my kind of practitioner lens is always there. But I'm super interested in understanding practitioners, how they operate, and ultimately how this will affect the quality and the kind of efficacy of democratic practice. So that's kind of what's sort of driven me into this area of research. In terms of context, this is a lot of stuff you know. Essentially, community engagement is so hot right now. It has been around in various forms for many, many years, but in its current form, probably only for the last sort of 30 or 40. You know, it's got those community activist roots. It's also got some pretty harsh colonial roots, which we don't talk about, and all sorts of other bits and pieces that kind of come into the mix. Now, of course, community engagement ranges from some pretty dull stuff like public submissions through to some really exciting democratic innovations. And I'm sure you'll hear about some of those over the next few days. Legislation is a massive driver, right? We've got more requirements in our local, state and federal acts which say people need to do engagement, organisations need to do engagement. It is the reason the practice is quite big in Australia. Whether you like it or you don't, doesn't matter, it's just a fact. Of course, because of this, there are now lots of practitioners, right? Lots of those beautiful faces that we just saw. And of course, it is a really, really important role, right? You guys design processes, you deliver them, you report on them, you evaluate them, you pay your mortgages through this work, all around this kind of democratic process stuff. So there's a lot going on. However, there's kind of a problem there that needs to be unpacked and explored. Now, Friedson is the professionalization dude. He's kind of like the expert that everyone goes to. And one of the widely accepted kind of premises about how professions work is that professionals use their knowledge and skills to serve individuals or the needs of a client or employer. So by looking after a customer or looking after a client or looking after a person, you're contributing to the greater good and the serving of community as a whole, right? Now, community engagement's a little bit different because you're kind of serving both parties at the same time. You're kind of wedged between needing to make sure that you're running a proper process for the community, but also kind of keeping the needs of your organisation, whether that's your client or your employer. So kind of protecting the process, but balancing the needs of both. So it's a really kind of tricky position because you're kind of the service provider, you're the beneficiary, you're a process guardian, you're an activist. There's kind of a lot happening in this space. So it's a little bit more complicated than a straight up kind of dentist who cleans your teeth and then, contributes to the well-being of a better place because people don't have as much gum disease, right? It's a little bit more nuanced than that and a little bit more complicated. So in terms of what we already know, now before 2006, honestly, not much. Researchers didn't really care about practitioners. They were concerned about all of these other variables when it came to participation and deliberation. So what about the topic? What about how many people are in the room? What about if a man or a woman speaks first? So they were really kind of concerned about all of these other sorts of factors. And then all of a sudden they've gone, hang on, kind of, in terms of variables, the facilitator that guides the process or the practitioner that designs it, they're actually kind of instrumental. The things that they do, the decisions they make along the way is hugely impactful for the process. So in 2008, a couple of famous Australian academics looked into the commercialisation of the deliberative market here in Australia. It's one of the first big kind of contributions to the body of knowledge. So they looked at it kind of from supply and demand. They looked at the growth of consultants, and keeping in mind this is 2008, at the end of it, they kind of came to the conclusion that it's a community of practice, right? The practitioners, the consultants that work in this space, it's very much a community practice, and it's not so much a marketplace, right? So keep that in mind because I might disagree with them a little bit later on. Now, Cooper and Smith over in the UK did some similar sort of research. They found the same sorts of things, but they also focused on the fact that public institutions, by their very nature, hinder the effectiveness of participatory processes, right? The bureaucracy is a very tricky space to operate in. They've kind of finally given us something that most of you probably already know. Now, there's Carolyn Lee in the States. She's a bit of I quite like her and some of her stuff. That's her book there on the right. She's published, and she's probably a bit more critical of this view of it's a community of practice and people play nicely together. She's a political sociologist by trade, but she looks at the economic drivers for engagement, such as commodification, standardization. She looks at the practitioners, and she concludes that practitioners are too focused on professionalization when they should be focused on what they're there for, which is actually about enhancing kind of democratic process, equity, inclusion, and all of these other kinds of values that they would associate. She's a bit more critical, but she's also a very interesting read. Other stuff has happened. So in 2014, the International Political Sciences Association had a symposium. They produced this little guide. I'll put it in the links afterwards because it's free and it's quite a nice little easy read. And as a result of that, it kind of got turned into a book. So Lawrence Verheer over in Montreal was the editor along with a couple of other people. And so papers that were part of that panel have kind of gone into this book. Now, there's nothing better than starting a PhD and 6 months later, somebody releases a book on your topic. Yay. But it's quite an academic read, but there's a lot in there. So they look at, there's a case study from Italy. They look at how professionals and the way they behave and the institutional frameworks regulate the field rather than kind of community or democracy or other bits. They look at France and how standardization is kind of leading to homogenization of practice and people are kind of doing off-the-shelf processes. Carolyn Lee's back in there as well with her same sort of argument. Lawrence is in there. She looks at how practitioners view their role and the sort of work they do and kind of comes up with a typology in terms of practitioner types, those ones that you can kind of see there. Jason Chilvers over in the UK, who focuses on facilitation in science and technology, talks about how, kind of similar to Carolyn Lee, that practitioners need to focus more on being reflexive rather than worrying about gaining legitimacy and credibility in the practice and kind of get back to what they're supposed to do. Oliver Escobar over in Scotland talks about public engagement practitioners, so those of you that are kind of situated inside public sector organisations. And there's also other stuff on pracademics and standardized practice and all the rest of it as well. There's other little sprinklings as well. So there's a bit of literature around how influential practitioners can be on the process. It kind of contradicts itself. So some authors have come out and said that, you know, practitioners are really valuable and they can enhance the quality of discussion and deliberation. But on the other hand, others have come out and said, look, they're kind of influencing attitudes and behaviours of participating. They're kind of participants. They're manipulating outcomes through decisions to censor themselves and others. So there's little micro decisions that we make as practitioners in the moment. Very complicated stuff. And of course, there's a quote there from Jane Mansbridge in terms of the facilitators being influenced by their professional norms that they've learned through training. So part of this today is to kind of look at what those professional norms are, what their training is, and what they're bringing to the practice. So my methodology, this is it in a slide, honestly, gets a good kind of 12,000 words in my thesis if you want to read it. But this is in a kind of nutshell. So the findings I'm going to present to you today come from two key data sets. The first one is a survey that was done. It was done online in the middle of 2017, which is ages ago now for normal people, but only yesterday in research years. It had a series of questions. We got 375 responses. Put a little emoji up if you're one of them, because I love you. Thank you so much. So 375 responses. Now, we don't know how big the population of practitioners are. There's no way of finding out. It's not like teachers and they have to be registered, or doctors and all the rest of it. So we don't know. But if we can assume that the population is about 15,000, which I don't think is unreasonable, we can be relatively confident with the results. But there is a kind of self-selection issue with the sampling and so forth. But it's better than nothing, which is kind of what we had. It also draws on late 2018. I did 20 interviews with some of the people that are in this room. It's de-identified, so I won't get them to kind of, you know, signal themselves. But I met with practitioners that were senior, so had 10 or more years of experience so that they could reflect on changes that they'd seen in industry and the field, mix of public and private, looking for a real kind of diversity of views so that we could kind of hit a saturation point. So both of those data sets are kind of at play in the stuff I'm showing you today. So in terms of who they are, where they come from, and the different types, these next slides draw predominantly from an article that was published at the end of last year, which is in the Journal of Public Deliberation, which is a free one. So you can grab hold of that if you want, but I'll just show you the highlights now. So who are the practitioners, right? In a nutshell, just warning, there's a few graphs coming up. They are pretty female. Yeah, pretty female. So normal Australian female workforce, 48%. In community engagement, it's kind of over 75%, which is pretty significant. Lends itself to issues around kind of women's work, pay issues, gender issues. There's a lot going on in that one. So it's an interesting finding in and of itself. So they're very female. They are pretty white. Yeah, pretty white. So this question, a couple of people took offense at it, which wasn't the intention. I was basically trying to find out if it was very white or not. And it is pretty white. So a lot of people not really identifying with any cultural group, so we can maybe make an assumption. A lot of Northwest Europeans. And these ones down here are anything from kind of like 1 person to about kind of 9. So it's a pretty small sample size. And where those little asterisks lie, if you compare comparatively the representation of the whole of Australia's population, that's where practitioners are underrepresented in those particular groups, which is perhaps concerning if you think the practitioner body, given it's all about democracy, should be reflective of the people it serves. Another finding. All right, so very female, very white. Typically tend to be employees. There's a few smatterings of people that work by themselves in small businesses through to larger businesses and so forth. Right, so female, white, employees, typically in local government, might be a sampling issue as well, but the legislative drivers suggest, local government has more requirements to do consultation, so that's not kind of unexpected either. And then sort of sprinklings of where the rest of them are employed, bit of state, bit of kind of private in there, and sprinklings of other bits, not many federal, and a sprinkling of kind of higher education at the end there. So we've got lots of white ladies that work in local government that are relatively well educated. So over half of practitioners have a bachelor's or above, which in Australia is only 22%. And you can see there's also a lot of postgraduate degrees. So many graphs. Let's see another one. This one, I love this one. I think this one's super awesome. This is what what practitioners' qualification areas are. So you'll see down the bottom, management is the kind of most popular, followed by PR, comms and media, followed by community development. There's a pretty eclectic bunch though, right? So it's not like they're all coming from the social sciences, or they're all coming from land use planning, or they're all coming from communications. They come from all over the place. And that kind of diversity of knowledge exists within people itself as well. So you'll see there 2.7 each. So that's 2.7 qualifications per practitioner. So it's everything kind of after high school. So Cert 3s through to sort of PhDs. So pretty educated. Now, these next few graphs, and it's the last of the graphs, are bonus graphs, right? Bonus graphs. So and that, which means I didn't put them in the paper because I didn't have enough words, but they might make their way into another paper someday. So one of the questions was, what do you call someone who works in community engagement? Not a lot of consensus there. I call myself a facilitator. I call myself a practitioner. I'm a professional. I'm an expert, right? So not a lot of consensus. How would you describe community engagement? It's a community of practice. No, it's a profession. No, it's a field. No, it's a discipline. I think it's a sector. It's a movement, right? So not a lot of consensus once again. A little bit more consensus here in that generally outside of community engagement circles, it's not really viewed as a practice, although some people that said yes were very, very certain in their kind of resolve in that area as well. So, interesting bunch. The question was posed. What informs practitioners' practice? And there were basically two big themes. So the first one was their previous work experience, study and training. So the jobs that they have done or were doing were hugely influential. The learning they did on the job was hugely influential, including the mistakes that they made. Lots of training and short courses were seen as quite influential. In terms of the formal qualifications, in terms of their degrees and so forth, they were a bit more divided. Some of them said, oh yeah, you know, I did teaching and I still kind of rely on this and this, but others were like, no, I don't use any of, you know, what I learned at uni, which I don't believe, but that's what they think. And the other key area was around the individual traits. So capabilities, interests, personality factors. So this belief that community engagement practitioners are comfortable with ambiguity, they're relatively flexible and adaptable, and they have a value set, which includes things like social justice and other sorts of principles that you would expect as well. So who they are as people and their experience that they have. So ultimately, if you kind of take all this, particularly the kind of qualifications and backgrounds, previous jobs and so forth into consideration, we've essentially got a bit of a broad church, right? Or a motley crew. Do you like my gift? I thought that was pretty proud of that one last night. That's I can tell how old you are if you get that one. So the wide diversity of knowledge and skills gained through formal and informal learning and workplace experience. So unlike other areas, think teaching, think nursing, there's no degree programs, there's no registration requirements. So there's no kind of standard core knowledge and skills, which of course raises the question, does the diversity in knowledge and experience of practitioners put community engagement practice and ultimately democracy at a disadvantage? So that's probably a whole nother PhD, and I'm not going to give you the answer to that question, but I definitely had a bit of a pick at it. So it's hard to see, but let's see what practitioners thought. Basically, they were pretty divided. A lot of practitioners were of the opinion that, look, different backgrounds and diversity was viewed as a strength. Those kind of, you know, if you've come with a land use planning background or an engineering background, you've got a different understanding of these sorts of projects which you can apply and you can use. But then sometimes in the next breath, they go, oh, yeah, but then they kind of have a bit of bias towards their previous background and experience. And there's too much variation in practice for it to kind of be widely understood what it is and why we're doing it for. So a bit of a divide. Now, practitioners were also asked in terms of, you know, how they're different from other sorts of practitioners, and there's kind of three key areas. Now, these aren't yes or no's, and some of them are kind of spectrums, but it's interesting to see how the practice is broadening and how it's being understood. So there was a kind of understanding amongst everybody that was interviewed that it's different for those that work inside an organisation that are typically kind of government employees doing community engagement practice versus the kind of consultants that come in, right? The role is, a lot of it is the same, but quite a lot of it is different as well. And I'll come back to that, some of that in the next section. The second factor that kind of deviated was some practitioners frequently worked on engagement processes that had limited scope, right? So not limited influence, but limited scope. They didn't have a lot of meaty negotiables, right? So they're kind of going out on more kind of infrastructure type projects around kind of colours and framings and timings, as opposed to let's create an entire program or service at the other end of the spectrum. So processes with considerable scope. For some practitioners, this was kind of seen as the communications versus community development divide. And so it can kind of overlay into a number of areas like that, but an important kind of delineation. And the last area where practitioners kind of divided was around the sorts of whether they were doing kind of one-off project work or discrete kind of timeframes, or if they were part of ongoing programs. So they were in their communities all the time, or they were doing community organisational sort of capacity building, organisational change sort of work as well, in which they're constantly in that environment as opposed to kind of in and out. So they're the three kind of big areas where they factored. How am I going for time? Not bad. I think I might have a good 5 minutes for questions at the end. I am totally ignoring the chat, by the way. I've got way too much to get through. I'll get to the end. There's nothing super important there, Claire. No, it's all good stuff though. It's all nice. Is it nice? Yeah, cool. All right, so the next set of findings are around what practitioners struggle with. So this is pretty much all that's contained in an article in the Journal of Sociology. I decided to be a sociologist, and it turns out I'm probably a bit better at it. Who'd have known? So this is, I was really interested in the tensions that practitioners explore, particularly if you think back to that cat photo of how on one side we've kind of got the community, you know, and then we've got the organisation and the project and how they sort of weigh them up. So I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. So the questions that we asked were, what's making it difficult or challenging to deliver good engagement? What types of tensions or dilemmas do you face in your work, and how do you manage these? Now, keep in mind, a lot of these responses were from senior practitioners, and I'll try to come back to that point later if I remember it. So the first big theme was this, you know, the whole kind of, you know, organisation on one side and community on the other. So it was very much an earnest desire to deliver meaningful engagement that satisfied the needs of the organisation as well as the community. And many were keen to appear neutral, but not necessarily all of them. So the neutrality and independence thing is interesting. It's kind of unique to Australia because of that legislative driver and the fact that so many practitioners are based inside organisations, and we don't kind of have that model like they have in the States where independently funded think tanks bring in an independent consultant on behalf of the community and organisation. The neutrality and the independence thing is a bit different, and they tend to use the word independent here rather than neutral, which is fascinating because, I mean, sorry to tell you this, but if you're taking the money from the organisation, you're not that independent. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy how practitioners sort of wrestle with that. So it's the first big one. The second big one was a perception of who they were working for. And there was a kind of, you know, the community thought that they were kind of aligned with the organisation, and the organisation thought that they were aligned with the community. So kind of playing this, you know, double agent role, which I've heard mentioned even kind of before I started my PhD as well. Also on this was the, you know, that kind of independence and neutrality bit that I wanted to kind of pull apart was interesting because, and those of you that know your IOP2 code of ethics pretty well is, you know, what are you trying to be independent of? What are you trying to protect here? Are you trying to be independent from the subject matter or the technical work? And that was important to most of the people that I spoke to. Are you trying to be independent, appear independent from the organisation? That was also important to most people. Independence from the community, though, was a little bit more mixed. So this kind of the need to side with the community or to put their views forward was kind of an interesting one. There was also a bit of a divide, and I found this quite interesting, particularly given that it's predominantly senior practitioners. There was a lack of agreement as to whether facilitation was a practitioner skill or a different skill set, in that, you know, you can design and deliver processes and you might have a bit of facilitation, or as a practitioner, you need to be able to facilitate, and it's kind of interchangeable. So a lot of the overseas literature doesn't delineate, but some of the practitioners here do, which is interesting.
That's an interesting one, Helen, because I think that's one of the sort of technical hard skills that people refer to as your facilitation skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of employer versus community, so continuing this theme. So before I kind of said that, Hendricks and Carson in 2008 sort of said, look, practitioners are pretty well balanced in terms of managing the need to kind of make money and kind of get the job done, as well as kind of, robust democratic process. But from what I've kind of looked at, it's probably a bit more nuanced than that. So a lot of it depends on how community engagement is perceived in their organisation, where they sit in the hierarchy, what they can get away with saying no to. So it's a little bit trickier than that. So the next theme is whether practitioners are based inside a public sector organisation or whether they're kind of private consultants. So from a public practitioner point of view, they often experience internal barriers. This is some of the stuff I spoke about before. So resistance from other staff, like, why do we have to do this? Go away. My project would be easier without you. Resistance from senior management, executives, and decision makers, right? Why do we, I'm already elected. Why do we need to talk to people to kind of make decisions? And there was, interestingly, and I was surprised by this, concerns about job security as well, in terms of I feel obliged to make sure that the project gets on with it, and I don't want to hold it up because I'm scared that they'll find someone who is less kind of combative than me to kind of get the project done, kind of at the sacrifice of the quality of the process, which is interesting and a little bit concerning. Private practitioners obviously were generally a bit more reserved in their responses as to what tensions do you describe. But the issue of trying to weigh up, and that's a beautiful quote, are they going to pay me for coming up with the wrong answer? The perception, however, was that being a private kind of consultant was a bit easier in that the path had been cleared. So conversations about, do we need to do engagement? Why are we doing it is important. A lot of that had happened before consultants arrive in the room. There's still a little bit of it, but the clearing of the path and that kind of internal activist role that public sector practitioners are forced to take wasn't there. Interestingly, the grass was not greener on the either side for both groups. So private thought, oh no, public looks too hard, and public sort of looked at private, went, oh no, that looks too hard. So I thought that was interesting as well. So the public sector stuff, so Oliver Escobar over in Scotland looks at some of this stuff. He finds that public practitioners have this extra responsibility of doing internal activism, and they suffer from burnout. My findings were pretty much the same, plus the fact that there was that lack of job security, particularly amongst younger practitioners. Now, this next section, this is a doozy, right? So this is themed under the area of constraints and behaviours of public institutions, right? So this is basically everything that's wrong with the bureaucracy that makes it hard to do community engagement. And it wound up, not surprisingly, being the longest list. So the countdown includes this number 8 I quite like, when the practitioner agrees with the community. This is the tension of, why did they make that decision? We decided that we wanted this. Why did they go with that? And the practitioner's sitting there going, oh no, right? Oh no, I don't understand it either, right? I'm losing the will to live. So that kind of issue. Number 7, when practitioners lack authority or lack autonomy to kind of be able to get on with things. It's an area that everybody is an expert in, which makes it a bit harder. People don't kind of offer expert advice on engineering projects, but everyone feels very confident offering expert advice on community engagement projects despite lack of experience or kind of qualifications. Number 6, and this was an interesting one because some people kind of would up and leave it over this issue, but when the engagement is tokenistic, so when there is little or no influence, some accept that that's the nature. Every now and then we do the kind of tokenistic stuff and it's not great, but we get to do some really good stuff. But a lot of us go, I just avoid it with a 10-foot pole. I don't want to build my reputation around tokenistic kind of engagement processes. Number 5 is when the bureaucracy and the decision makers aren't aligned. It typically looks like public sector staff getting really excited about the opportunity to doing cool stuff, and decision makers going, no, we've already made up our mind. We don't want to do any engagement on it. Thanks very much. And finding out sometimes a little bit too late. Number 4 is when decision makers are not fully committed or understanding of the process. I don't need to explain that. I think most of you guys know that one. Number 3 was interesting. So I've kind of discovered that the palliative, so when a community comes up with something that the organisation didn't quite expect, right? So when they go a little bit kind of outside of the colouring lines, decision makers seem to be fine with that, but it was often the political advisors and senior public servants that got very nervous and would try to interfere at that point. Hang on, that's not what we agreed. We didn't think they'd come up with that, and they would try to manage the risk, which would put obviously the integrity of the process at risk. Number two is the kind of that dichotomy of how to balance the expert and community views, particularly in science-based organisations struggle with that one. And then there's the good old, we go in and do something really fabulous with the community engagement and we leave the decision for them to implement and nothing happens for a long time or never. Can be quite frustrating for practitioners as well. Now, the interesting bit is in the face of all of these tensions, what do they do, right? And there's not a kind of industry guideline of do this and do that. So it's very much a tell us what you do when these sorts of things happen. So there was basically 3 strategies. The first strategy, my personal favourite, avoidance. That sounds like a really interesting project. I'm just really busy in the next few months. I can give you some other names of some other people that can help you, right? So just, sorry, go away. Obviously depends on if you are inside the organisation or outside the organisation. Much easier to do if you are outside. Although, you know, could be pretty funny doing it inside as well. Strategy number 2 is the good old prevention, or more kind of preparation. It's just kind of like getting them ready with what might happen and what they might do, and kind of coaching them through the process of all the things that will happen along the way, including the things that organisations might see as unexpected. So they're the first two preferences. First, I try to avoid it. If that doesn't work, then we kind of get really ready for it. And then if it doesn't work and it kind of hits ahead, then it's the having very honest and very difficult conversations with your client or with your organisation. Now, there's a few things to kind of note in all of these approaches. Part of it has to do with your position, right? So these were senior practitioners, so they made comments to the fact that, you know, your experience tells you which ones to fight, which ones to let go of, you know, how to pick your battles. Confidence often comes with that experience to make those calls. Position in hierarchy is really important. You know, if you're a band 4 local government officer going, I don't think this is very good, you're in a very different situation from an executive director going, no, we're not going to do that. Relationships with senior leaders and decision makers was seen as very important in facilitating kind of these strategies and how you dealt with them, as well as the profile of community engagement in that organisation. You know, if you were a high performing organisation doing lots of fabulous community engagement, your path would be easier, as opposed to you're the first dedicated resource trying to tell people that it's not what they think it is. It's not public relations, it's about engagement, it's about democracy. So that was interesting. So I like that I came up with these results, but what I'd really love to do is talk to inexperienced and junior practitioners, because I think that this is super helpful if you're experienced, but if you're inexperienced, what are you doing? Are you just going, okay, yeah, that doesn't sound good, but whatever, which really concerns me for the kind of quality of the practice. One more note, and this is on principles and values. So a number of practitioners, not all of them, but a number of them made reference to the principles that guide their own practice. So, and that's how they pick their battles. So if they're kind of faced with something difficult and they go, you know what, no, that's going to exclude people from the process, and inclusion of, you know, is really important to me, so that's what I'm going to go in for. So they use that as their guide. So it might be around kind of inclusion, it might be around transparency, it might be around, you know, whether the process is tokenistic or not, but that's the guide that they used, and that's the language that they used with themselves and also with their client and organisation to kind of say, this is what I'm not prepared to do. Oh my God, I'm going to get through all of it. This is awesome. I deleted like 20 slides before we started today because I had way too much, even though I'm still talking really fast. That's all right. Just watch it slow speed later on. So what else is happening in the area? So this is research that is coming soon. So I don't know if it was last year or the year before, time's lost all meaning, but I went to a conference in Montreal, the International Conference of Public Participation, also known as ICPP, because they don't really think about what these acronyms sound like when you say them out loud. And we had a panel on facilitators, moderators, practitioners. Everyone uses slightly different language. And as a result, there is a special issue coming together of local government studies. So So they're looking at government-induced participatory and deliberative policy making, so government-led, co-produced public services, so collaborative, impacty stuff. It's a bit of a mix in there, and community-induced or community-led kind of engagement processes. And it's going to include research on lots of different areas. So there's some stuff in there from kind of Scotland. There's some stuff in there from Canada. There's a bit of stuff in there from the Netherlands, and I've got a typo and it's annoying me. So lots of kind of different pieces in there. So that's a special issue that I'm co-editing with Lawrence Beher and Imrat Verhoeven in the Netherlands. So I'm currently reading through all those articles at the moment, but it seems to have gained momentum, this kind of practitioner stuff. It's kind of getting sessions at conferences now, and there's a bit of sort of fascination in terms of who these people are, why they're so important. So it'll be really interesting to see where the research kind of continues around this area, because I think it's hugely underrated how much of an impact practitioners, facilitators have on these processes. It's not to say there's also other stuff happening. So you find within the research literature, they use slightly different language. So there's stuff in community development in terms of the worker. In policy, they love talking about street level bureaucrats, which would kind of be what a lot of practitioners are in their roles. So there's often, you know, the language is same, but a little bit different given the kind of breadth of the field. Oh my God, I did it. So I'm going to stop talking and take a sip of water.
That's
what have we got?
An amazing amount of information in a very short amount of time. And so much of that, like I think I was getting goosebumps out of your excitement and energy, but also goosebumps in so much of that is relatable. So I've had time in local government and state government, and now I'm in a consultancy practice, and I'm kind of like, there's so much, there's pros and cons in all of those environments for an engagement practitioner, but there's so much of a common thread as well. And that, you know, some of the things you were talking about, that dual position that you've got where you're advocating for the good practice, you're advocating for what the community's telling you, but you're also, you know, wanting the organisation to get the best possible outcome that they're seeking as well. So you really become that kind of meat in the sandwich. And yeah, you know, the more experience you get, the more you can kind of influence and nudge and choose your battles and that sort of thing. But I think if you're going to pick up a thread where you go into people who are new to the practice, you know, our budding practitioners, then that would be fascinating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I just saw the happy birthday, Claire. Sorry. Happy birthday, Claire.
Forget about that. We don't want to.
Anyway. I did sing it once on Zoom. It was terrible. I'll sing it to you later.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions for Helen? We do have probably about 15 minutes before we have to wind up, because we do have a 2 p.m. conference session as well. But if anyone does have a question, there's none in the chats, but I'm really happy for you to unmute and ask a question. We're a friendly bunch.
Oh, no.
You have wowed them. No one's unmuting. They're being very polite.
Okay, I've got a question for Helen.
Max, go ahead.
What was the most surprising bit of research that you uncovered, or evidence or insights? What shocked or surprised you the most?
I knew the diversity of backgrounds, actually. I knew there was a mix, like having seen people come through IAP2 trainings and so forth. I've seen there's a lot of ex-teachers, there's a lot of comms, there's a few kind of journalist refugees. I knew there was a mix, but I wasn't quite prepared for that level of diversity. And I think I'm a little bit concerned by it because, you know, in the interest of self-disclosure, I was a teacher originally, and I think that even teaching looks different. We had a lot of theory behind us. So when we made those decisions, we kind of knew what we were doing, right? This kid's not paying attention. Oh, hang on, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have you had breakfast, right? So we kind of had enough to make sense of things. And my concern is that with such a diversity, there is, and there's not a common understanding of what community engagement is and what it's for. And I think that's its greatest kind of strength and weakness at the same time. So I kind of had I suspected there was a bit of that, but I guess I wasn't kind of prepared for how big it was. I got a thumbs up, so Max is happy with that.
Yeah. Like a question going back to that diversity, is the lack of diversity because lots of community engagement strategies, particularly government-based, are very white, for example, structured, format, fast-paced grant deadlines, those, you know, all of those sort of structures around it?
Look, I'm not probably qualified to answer that. I'm not a diversity specialist. My guess is the whole of society is geared to the white, right? Government is geared. Yeah, people, you know, there's higher rates of education. All of that is kind of geared against different formats of learning, contribution, decision making, and so forth. So I actually think that it's probably way bigger than, you know, we write strategies in a white way. I think it's everything.
I don't think it's an engagement sector issue necessarily, but it's definitely something to be mindful of. And I do feel the sector has that mindfulness of diversity and inclusion more than other sectors that I have, or equally as other sectors. There's a good left of field one here. What's the best way, or it goes back to that, you know, starting out question. What's the best way for an early career practitioner to get started in the field?
I reckon this is one to take on to the Facebook, actually, because I have a few ideas, but I'm sure there's a lot of very experienced practitioners in the room that can add to this one. I think that actually getting a mentor is probably a good idea. The people that really seem to get their stuff, know their stuff, often have worked with somebody who knows their stuff really, really well. And I think that can help. I think if you're kind of working under somebody or near somebody that doesn't really get engagement, then you'll kind of struggle a little bit more. So if I had to pick one, I'd say get a mentor, do your reading, attend conferences like this, get yourself known. Yeah,
absolutely. And have you had a chance to look at how community engagement appears in tertiary education? So we understand it's not really very present, but have you sort of explored a bit more?
I haven't explored it. I tend to accidentally butt up against it all the time. So the language thing is really interesting. So most of you guys would say community engagement or even public engagement. The literature says public participation for the most part still. So if you type community engagement into Google Scholar, what you get is actually what I would call the outreach work that universities do with their communities, but they've kind of claimed the term academically. So there's been some really cool articles I've liked the sound on, and I've clicked on them, and it's more about that kind of university outreach stuff. So long answer to a question, which is basically no. But only by accident.
Yeah.
There's another PhD, Emily.
Absolutely. Helen, there's also a question going back to that, the issue of influence, the ability to influence. And do you think that there's a link to that makeup that you referred to early on in the workforce of, majority gender, that kind of thing? Is there something there around that confidence and influence?
Yeah, there might be. And this is me speaking as a practitioner because I can't sort of definitively say as a researcher. I think it's probably the way that organisations are geared these days. So I think what's driving a lot of practice is risk aversion rather than democratic robustness. So when risk aversion wins, people don't like decisions to be challenged, or, hang on, that's not inclusive enough. We need to stop and bring more people in. All of that is seen as a risk rather than making a process more robust. And I've got, that's an idea for another article I'm going to write at some time because I've got some data there, but I do think the risk is winning out over democracy, and it just speaks to the nature of how problematic it can be to kind of bring it into that space, really, the fact that you're trying to bring people into a bureaucracy which is geared more towards representative democracy rather than anything else. So
well, there's a few shares and a few links to training and things like that. But what is next for you, Helen? What's the rabbit hole you're going to jump down, or the?
I've got no idea. I'm tired. I'm going to have a rest. Yeah, I'm tired. I'm not terribly sure. Yeah, we'll see. I've got to finish that special issue, so I'm reading kind of articles for that one, which is sort of cool. Yeah, I'm not sure. Watch this space. I'm not terribly sure. Oh, we've got minutes left. I should have added those extra 17 slides that I deleted.
You really could have, but I think, we do have the opportunity to keep this conversation going, and it's something that's so intricately linked to so many other conversations that are going on. Community engagement is so vital at the moment. The role of the practitioner is so vital at the moment. I used to have a bit of a way of talking about it at DELP, where I said even a nudge is enough to influence. If you just have one conversation and you've changed someone's view in such a small way, if that's the role of an engagement practitioner, to be able to nudge people into something a little bit better or something a little bit different, then, you know, we're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so,
Absolutely.
yeah, there's a lot more conversations to be had, and
Yeah.
I encourage everyone to keep going, whether you're new to this or you're, you know, one of those, you know, really experienced, confident, influential people. Yeah, I encourage the conversation to keep on going.
Yeah.
And find a mentor and a mentee. That might be one of the
There's some good ones out there, but
takeaways.
there's also a bit of a glut in that there's a lot of inexperienced practitioners and not a lot of sort of super experienced practitioners as well, which can make it a little bit tricky. Claire, I will add, I've put a slide up there as well. If you want a kind of summary page, I'll put all the links to the kind of free things to find and articles to read and all the rest of it that I've made reference to in there. If you would like to unpack this a little bit more and have a conversation, I'm conscious that the kind of chunk of slides I deleted were actually all around professionalisation and standardisation. I just was, we don't have enough time to do them justice, even with me speaking at this ridiculous pace. So if you want to kind of have a look at that stuff and then maybe have a bit of time to unpack and discuss, we'll see what kind of interest there is. And if so, put something on. I don't know, easy done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, maybe best way, if you don't know Helen directly, is get onto that Turn It Up Conference Facebook page. Yep. We'll all be there to join the conversation. And also, if you want the recording and the slideshow from today, make sure you sign up to the Kapia newsletter. Otherwise, I think wrapping up a few minutes early is not a bad idea, because people might be going on to the next conference session.
Yeah, they need to stretch their legs in between.
And
that's
need to have a coffee break. So thank you so much, Helen. I really, I mean, I got a lot out of that. I've, you know, been close to this already, but I got so much out of that again. And I'm sure others did too, getting some really beautiful comments in the chat. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well done. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. I wish I could have chats with all of you and have a boogie.
Thanks, Helen.
Do that next time. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
for joining us.